Coming into this week, week 10 of the season, Lane Johnson had only allowed 2 pressures the entire year. Not sacks, not QB hits, pressures. Just for context on how insane that is, over the last 10 years across the league, Johnson is the only offensive tackle to allow only 2 pressures in the first 9 weeks of a season. Nobody else who's had at least 150 pass blocking snaps has managed to get that low. And only 3 tackles have even come close out of the hundreds that qualify over the last decade, allowing only 3 pressures. That was Tristan Wirfs in 2022, David Bakhtiari in 2017, and of course, Lane Johnson again in 2020. In fact, as far as dominant 8-game stretches to start a season go, Lane has 4 of the top 10 most efficient season starts by any offensive tackle since 2014. Those seasons, of course, being 2016, where he gave up 6 pressures in the first half of that year, 2022, where he also only gave up 6 pressures, 2020, where he gave up 3, like I mentioned, and of course, this year, where he's down at 2. If you combine all of those games together, which is roughly 2 full seasons worth of starts, the 17 combined pressures across all 4 of those stretches would still be less than the 21 pressures that Ronnie Stanley's given up in just the first half of this year alone. And Ronnie Stanley's good, don't get me wrong, but that is the difference between good, even really good, and generational. Make no mistake about it, what we are witnessing right now is one of the very best football players to have ever existed. And he's still at the top of his game. But of course, because I'm me, you know this video isn't just about Lane Johnson being great, it's about how he's great. It's about all the little veteran tricks of the trade that he employs on a weekly basis to shut pass rushers down. Some of those tricks that he even demonstrated for me personally when I went out to watch him and Duke Manyweather do their O-Line Masterminds clinic out in Dallas this past summer, which, believe me, we'll get to that because that was an invaluable resource for the making of this video. So if you love all the little nitty-gritty details of offensive line technique, this one's for you. Before I get going though, I do want to note for all the Eagles fans watching this video that if you're looking for a new Eagles hoodie for yourself or for another Eagles fan in your life, we did just relaunch our revamped version of the Philly Special hoodie. I know this isn't like a great view of it because of my camera angle, so I'll throw images of it on the screen. But for all of our Play Art series of hoodies that you know and love at this point, we've had them out for years. We're refreshing all the designs, and the Philly Special hoodie was the first one. So if you're interested in that for either yourself or for a loved one this holiday season, you can find that at the QR code on the screen or the link in the description below. Ideally, shipping usually doesn't take that long, so you should be able to get it with plenty of time to spare for the holidays. So again, if you're interested, those are now available. And if you're not interested, that is perfectly okay too. For the rest of you, let's talk about pass sets. When you look at how Lane Johnson takes his pass sets, the 2 things that stand out the most are stance and angle. His inside knee and ankle are always going to be lined up vertically. Duke Manyweather, who's one of the best offensive line coaches on the planet, calls this stacking joints. And Lane stacks these joints so that he has access to the entire bottom surface area of his foot when he pushes off. He's not just on the ball of his foot or on his heel or on the outside of his foot. He's putting force into the ground with that whole foot. And there's the added benefit of reducing false steps too with that inside foot. Meaning with Johnson's weight being balanced on that entire foot, he's engaging all of his leg muscles and all of them are loaded and ready to go. He doesn't have to put weight into the foot and then push off. That weight is already there, so he fires off from that stance with no wasted movement. Also, yes, side note, I know this is where a lot of people are going to chime in and say, well, yeah, but what about the false starts? He's always leaving early. Trust me, he's not. I made an entire video on that topic last year, so go check that out after you finish this one. Lane is mostly just playing within the gray areas of the rules that allow for him to move his back foot right before the ball is snapped. But the reason why he can move his back foot so dramatically is because his front foot is drilled into the ground with all of his weight. It's not moving. He's just loaded and ready for bear once the ball moves in the center's hands. He wouldn't get away with all that pre-snap movement if his stance and timing were not perfect, but they are. Again, I encourage you to go watch that other video I made last year because it explains it in detail, but that's kind of beside the point. Beyond stance, the other major element of Johnson's pass sets that I want to talk about here is angle of departure. He's not a jump setter like many tackles around the league are, meaning he's not going to try to go out there and engage as fast as possible and get hands-on and fight you. That's generally not his style. What Lane likes to do is get vertical in his sets, get as deep as possible, and delay engagement for as long as possible. Oftentimes he'll go through 6, maybe even 7 steps before he and the edge rusher make contact, You'll see a kick step, a gather step, another kick, another gather, and then another kick and gather. And next thing you know, he's 6 yards behind the line of scrimmage before he's even touching anybody. And that strategy is purposeful because the deeper an edge rusher gets into the pocket, the less likely they are to throw any fancy pass rush moves like swims, spins, or chops. Those are generally going to be moves that you see early in a rush to get a quick win when a tackle shoots his hands early, like say in a jump set. But late in a rush against a vertical set, 6 yards deep in the pocket, with a tackle that's not going to give you his hands, like Lane Johnson, all you can really do is throw a power move. And Johnson is comfortable with that, by the way. He will actively invite rushers into his chest and say, go ahead, try to run through me, because he knows most of the time they can't. Just watch his shoulders here. This is teach tape for any young offensive lineman. Look at how square he stays to the line of scrimmage. This is purposeful because A, square shoulders make it way easier to react to any sort of inside move or a stunt because you're not turned too far outside too early. But B, keeping your shoulders as square as possible, as long as possible, also helps to create a favorable angle to handle a power rush. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about here, I'll explain that by using a counter example of what happens when you turn too quickly and you don't stay square. This is Joe Alt, a young rookie for the Chargers, who himself is also excellent, but he's still learning what he can and cannot get away with at the NFL level. Myles Garrett ran straight through him here for a sack, and sure, you could just chalk that up to Myles being Myles, and that's true, but at the same time, it was really bad technique on Alt's end that allowed this to happen. Watch his shoulders, watch his angle, and then watch when he turns to face Garrett. Kick step, gather step, kick step, gather step. On that second gather step, he's already turning, which means as Garrett is landing that bull rush into his chest, he's actually doing it from about a 45-degree angle off center of Alt's sternum. He's not directly running into him from head on because Alt isn't presenting the correct angle. And you can do this with somebody at home to kind of demonstrate the physics of it and kind of feel it for yourself too, but it's way harder to stop somebody from running through you from the side or even from a 45-degree angle compared to when you're trying to stop them straight on. So Alt, who is a monstrous human, gets forklifted off the ground because he took that bull rush from a really bad angle and he had no shot here. He couldn't re-anchor, he had no position of balance or strength to counter power with power, and Garrett just ran through that inside shoulder immediately. You contrast all of that poor technique with Lane Johnson's technique here, and you can see a small subtlety that makes a big difference. Focus on this. Kick, gather, kick, gather. He's still square after 4 steps. And on his 5th step, you can see his angle switch from trying to get width to trying to get depth. He's buying himself just a fraction of a second more time here by trying to get more vertical. Again, the more he draws that edge rusher in, the more he's inviting that power. He wants these guys to chase him into the deep end of the pool so that he can drown them. That's the whole point. It's not until step number 6 that he really starts to turn his shoulders, but he's only doing so to match the approach of the edge rusher. And he's only going to a 45-degree angle from the line of scrimmage. He's not going all the way perpendicular. Alt made that mistake, but Lane does not. The key here is to be face mask to face mask. If the edge's face mask is inside of yours as the offensive tackle, you're wrong. They're just going to run through you like Garrett did. But if you're face to face, locking horns evenly, that's how you take on a bull rush with a proper angle from a position of balance and strength. Josh Hines-Allen here simply could not muscle through Lane fast enough to the inside, and Hurts just sat there comfortably at a pretty normal pocket depth of 8 to 9 yards so that he could make this throw, which of course got broken up, but again, that's beside the point. The pass pro was great. Now, there is one more element that I want to talk about here with how Johnson handles pass protection, and it's perhaps the most underrated minor technical detail that defines his style of play, and that detail is how he lands his punch. Before we get to that though, I do want to note that I was on a trip earlier this week with my wife to celebrate our 7th anniversary, and so we came back around Wednesday evening, and so I only had about 48 to 72 hours to actually make this episode, which if, again, you know me, that's generally impossible. So I have been grinding for the last, again, 2 to 3 days to try to get this thing done by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday night, and the only reason I think I might make that deadline is because I have not left the apartment to eat. I've just had a bunch of Factor meals in the fridge that I've been grinding through for the last day and a half, 2 days at this point. So if you're watching this from Factor, thank you for, again, paying me. but also thank you for literally making this episode possible in the first place. And for those of you that don't already know what Factor is, they make meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. All of the meals can be heated up in the microwave in just 2 minutes, they taste great, and there's a ton of variety so you never get bored. There's over 35 different meal options per week with more than 60 add-on options as well, including their smoothies and refresher juices, which I also picked up this month. So if you're interested in getting meals that can be made fast, eaten conveniently, and still be tasty, all delivered to your door, I encourage you to check out Factor. And if you do want to do that, you can go to factor75.com or just use the link below and use promo code FILMROOM50FREE, all one word, and that's going to get you 50% off your first Factor box plus free shipping. Again, that is code FILMROOM50FREE, all one word, at factor75.com or at the link below, and that'll get you a 50% discount and free shipping on that first box. So thank you again to Factor for sponsoring today's show and for even making it possible by sending me food. And with that, let's get back to it. I want to start here with a little clip of Lane Johnson himself talking about his pass protection technique when he was at the O-Line Mastermind Summit in Dallas this past summer. Me and my podcast partner EJ were invited to come out and observe the summit as flies on the wall, and in that summit, some of the best offensive linemen in the game today, as well as in eras past, came together to impart their knowledge on young and up-and-coming linemen that are both in the NFL and in college. It's a wonderful event, and I learned so much while I was there, but in particular, I learned a lot from hearing Lane talk about his technique.
But for me, I was always thinking, when we gain ground with these guys, I want to have time to establish my foundation to where I'm not reading the rush, and then I'm just waiting. I give these guys my chest. When I first got in the league, Stout showed me pictures of Munoz, Walter Jones, and all of them in the game were like this with their hands right here waiting. And so I give the defender my chest, and I like that. Now, times when guys struggle with a bull rush is because their hands are not sequencing the same time with their feet. So a lot of times they may make contact, but a foot will be in the air, so all your power's not being generated together. So a lot of problems with the bull rush is your hands aren't married to your feet.
Now, there's a couple things he touched on there that I want to highlight. Number one, Jeff Stoutland molded a young Lane Johnson into the player he is today by showing him, in part, the technique of Seahawks great Walter Jones. And, because I'm me, I of course have the All-22 from those mid-2000 Seahawks teams that featured prime Walter Jones. On the tape, you can see exactly what Lane was referencing when he talked about Jones's hand placement. He, just like Johnson, had no qualms about leaving his hands low and wide and inviting contact into his chest because he knew that if any edge rusher tried to run straight through him, he was going to be able to anchor against that power effectively. Even a young DeMarcus Ware stood zero shot against the raw strength of Walter Jones because Jones is one of the best examples ever of an offensive tackle who knew how to marry his hands to his feet. Just look at the shape of Jones here. He is effectively turning himself into a human pole vault. When that anchor leg goes down and back into the ground, he pairs that with a forklift motion with his hands that almost weaponizes the recoil of that leg planting into the ground, and he shoots the force of that recoil up and under the chest of the edge rusher. That forces the rusher up, and they lose all leverage, and therefore all power. Lane Johnson does the exact same thing because Jeff Stoutland had him model some of his game off of Walter Jones. When he strikes into an edge rusher's chest, he doesn't punch out, he punches up. He does everything he can to time it with the planting of his first anchor step so he can shoot that recoil back into them. He keeps his elbows as close to 90 degrees as possible, so again, it kind of creates that forklift shape rather than a straight punch. Again, he doesn't want that force going out, he wants it going up. Because if that force goes up, the edge rusher goes nowhere. Play after play, game after game, month after month, year after year, Lane Johnson's technique stays consistent. But more importantly, it stays effective. Because at the end of the day, his technique is just physics. That's all it is. Just physics. And I suppose being 6'6", 325 with 35-inch arms and a 99th percentile athletic profile probably helps a little bit too, I guess. All right, I think that'll do it for me today. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit more about offensive line technique. Before I go, I do want to thank Duke Manyweather and Brandon Thorne and Lane Johnson and everybody who puts on the O-Line Masterminds Clinic every single summer, because a lot of what I learned to make this video directly came from that week that I was there. I probably learned more about O-line technique in those 2 days than I've learned in the other decade of doing this professionally. And that's only possible because I was able to directly ask Lane questions. I asked Creed Humphrey questions, Trey Smith, Alan Faneca, Steve Hutchinson, Robbie Tobeck. Like, I can't describe how valuable that entire week was for me in terms of learning the ins and outs of offensive line play, at least. It's a top-notch event, one of the best football events I've ever been to, and I really hope to get to go back again this coming summer. So, Duke, if you see this, thank you once again for everything you do. And with that, I'll see you guys later.